We have the distinct honor of having Sandy Lowe speak with us again this year. I guarantee you that his ideas will provoke in you some deep thought. But before he starts, I'd like to tell you a bit about him. Sandy Lowe is an instructor in the Religious Studies and Humanities Department at Santa Rosa Junior College. He has spoken at the Holocaust Lecture Series for several years on this topic. He has a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, a master's in Hebrew literature from Hebrew Union College in New York, as well as a bachelor's in Hebrew literature. He has a doctor of ministry from Pacific School of Religion, and also a doctor of divinity from Hebrew Union College. His ideas are always provocative and always enjoyable, and I would like to present to you Dr. Sandy Lowe.
We have really very limited time, and we have in probably less than an hour to try to cover about 2,000 years. Well, I usually take an hour and a half to do that, so it'll take some condensing, but I hope to hit it at most of the important parts, and then let you duke it out in your sessions. I want to start an article that has one of the more laughable stories that appeared recently, thanks to our very, very good friend, Jerry Falwell. I don't know what I would do without him. He's an endless source of audio visuals and so forth. At any rate, I'm just going to read this to you. It's actually a combination of two reports on this story, in case those of you who haven't heard this one. The Reverend Jerry Falwell has angered Jewish and other religious leaders by that the Antichrist, prophesied in the biblical book of Revelations, is a Jewish man living today. I'm not claiming this, by the way. Addressing a January 14th conference of fundamentalist pastors in Kingsport, Tennessee, Falwell said the Antichrist has to be Jewish because Christ was a Jew. Quote, "Is he alive and here today? Probably," Falwell said, "because when he appears, tribulation period, he will be a full-grown counterfeit of Christ. And if, in fact, the Lord is coming soon, and he'll be an adult at the presentation of himself, he must be alive somewhere today." It's an ironclad honor. Abraham H. Foxman, director of the Anti-Defamation League, accused Falwell of promoting anti-Semitism. Quote, "In identifying the Antichrist as a living Jewish man, Falwell draws from an especially vicious tradition of Christian theological anti-Judaism," Foxman said. "It appears clear that after years of Christian-Jewish dialogue, Reverend Falwell hasn't learned a thing." Leaders of the American Jewish Congress agreed. Quote, "It may be that Reverend Falwell did not overtly intend his comment to provoke a broad anti-Semitism fallout," the Congress said in a statement. "If so, he was wrong. History unambiguously teaches that the unexplained preaching of an arcane Christian theological concept like those advanced by Reverend Falwell has an inevitably incendiary and degrading effect on Christian attitude toward Jews." In Richmond, Virginia, Roman Catholic Bishop Walter F. Sullivan issued a statement condemning Falwell's remarks. Quote, "Reverend Falwell's claims are an absolute offense to our sisters and brothers," read the statement. "They deserve our strictest rejection, rebuttal, and condemnation." In a separate letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Sullivan added that Falwell's comments are, quote, "as reprehensible as they are dangerous. They incite prejudice and hatred by defining, as he does, the Antichrist to be a Jewish counterfeit of Christ, he recklessly targets Jewish people as the fountainhead of evil itself. So it's a pretty, on his part, I think a pretty casual, but nevertheless profoundly stupid remark. And what's interesting about this is that snapping right on it, where of course one would expect Jewish spokespeople, but also a Roman Catholic bishop in no uncertain terms condemning the statement. However, Falwell laid a statement attempting to clarify his remarks. Quote, "This belief is 2,000 years old and has no anti-Semitic roots," Falwell said. "This is simply historic and prophetic Orthodox Christian doctrine that most theologians, Christian and non-Christian, have understood for 2 millennia. And here, I have to agree with Mr. Falwell. I think he's truly right. Righter than the right he usually claims. It's nice to see that there's response to him, but I really do think he's got it right. I think that Orthodox Christian doctrine, as taught by Christian theologians and non-Christian theologians over 2 millennia, has been anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. So he's got that one right. It's my task today to outline and explain how this anti-Judaism, how the genocidal anti-Semitism, which grew into, I believe, Hitler's Holocaust, indeed may have had its roots not only in Christian doctrine generally, but in the New Testament in particular, and in the developing discourse of European Orthodox Christianity. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the short time available. I also hope to review some of the post-Holocaust criticism and correction to these arguments, and also to speculate and project what more needs to be done. So, yes. It begins with the charge of deicide. And since you chalk, I'm going to use it. If I could find it. Here it is. The word means killing God. And the charge is rooted, I believe, and I think many others do as well, in the literature itself of the New Testament. Maybe you've heard it. And I think that the whole of our issue pivots around 2 accusations, essentially, against the Jewish people. The first is the charge that the Jewish people, certainly at the time of Jesus, were responsible for his death. Now, since Christians also, or many Christians, came to believe that Jesus was an incarnation of the Father God, then this killing of Jesus was also of God. A pretty drastic accusation. As a result of that murder, the Jewish people are punished at that time, in particular, with the destruction of Jerusalem. And in order to get this really clearly set, in case you haven't read this material before, this is what I'd like to start with. So you've got material in front of you. I hope I have me. Yeah. With 2 selections from the New Testament. The first, actually both coming from the book of Matthew. The first one I'd like to read with you is chapter 27. Slightly edited. I took 1 paragraph out of it, the paragraph about Judas. And would like to just read that with you in case you've never read it before. It speaks for itself. The question, as you read it, should be kept in your mind. According to this document that we're reading, who is responsible for the death of Jesus. Okay? So, when morning came, the chief priests and elders of the nation met in conference to plan the death of Jesus. Well, it tells you right there who's responsible. The chief priests and the elders. They then put him in chains and led him away to hand him over to Pilate, the governor. Jesus was now brought before the governor, and as he stood there, the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "The words are yours," said Jesus, and to the charges laid against him by the chief priests and elders he made no reply. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear all this evidence that is brought against you?" But he still refused to answer one word, to the governor's great astonishment. At the festival season, it was the governor's custom to release one prisoner chosen people. There was then in custody a man of some notoriety called Jesus Barabbas. When they were assembled, Pilate said to them, "Which would you like me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah?" For he knew that it was out of malice that they had brought Jesus before him. While Pilate was sitting in court, a message came from his wife. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I was much troubled on his account in my dreams last night." Meanwhile, the chief priests and elders had persuaded the crowd to ask for the release of Barabbas and to have Jesus put to death. So when the governor asked, "Which of the two do you wish me to release to you?" they said, "Barabbas." "Then what am I to do with Jesus called Messiah?" asked Pilate. And with one voice they answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What harm has he done?" Pilate asked, but they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Pilate could see that nothing was being gained. Riot was starting. So he took water and washed his hands in full view of the people, saying, "My hands are clean of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And with one voice the people cried, "His blood be on us and on our children." He then released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So I hope that's clear. And just out of curiosity, for how many of you is this the very first time you've ever read? Let's see. That's significant. In a way, that's good, that it's not being read regularly in the churches, or that you don't get fed it on a regular basis. But understand that it's an important part of New Testament, an important part of the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. I think the problem, although it's not a problem in a certain way, is that we have been so horrified by the consequences of the charge embedded in everything that we just read, a charge coming from 2,000 years ago. We are so horrified by the consequences over the centuries that at this point in our lives we think it better just to remain silent about it. And that's a respectful attitude, and I would be happy to bury the damn thing, but I don't think that's the way to get rid of it. That's why I take the pains on a day like this to share this with you and say, okay, this is where I think it all starts. It starts with the charge of deicide. Now, that explains the curse that comes on the Jewish people. And it's not just on the elders of that day, but as it says, it's almost that the Jewish people, which I think they do all the time, you've seen Jews running out into the street invoking God's curse upon themselves and their children. Don't you see that happening all the time? Well, that's what the story is saying. That there's an invocation not simply of let the punishment fall on us, but on us and on our children. And unfortunately, words were taken very seriously and very literally through the ages. Now over to chapter 23, also in Matthew. This one, we're not going to read the whole thing because it's just too much to read, but it's sometimes referred to as the diatribe against the Pharisees. In the previous chapter, the Pharisees weren't mentioned at all. The elders were, and they probably were Sadducees and priests. The Pharisees were a different group of people. They were the rabbis. The only leadership in Israel that survived the destruction of Jerusalem, and from their ranks grew rabbinic Judaism. So they're an important group of people. And here is Jesus addressing them, addressing things about them, and see what elements you can pick up from it. Chapter 23. Jesus then addressed the people and his disciples in these words. The doctors of the law and the Pharisees sit in the chair of Moses. I'm going to interrupt. I would think that that means that he's endorsing them. He's saying that's good. They are when it comes to the Torah and the law and the tradition, go to the Pharisees because they really know what's going on. They sit in the chair of Moses. Therefore, do what they tell you, pay attention to their words, but do not follow their practice. For they say one thing and do another. They make up heavy packs and pile them on men's shoulders, but will not raise a finger to lift the load themselves. Whatever they do is done for show about with broad phylacteries and with large tassels on their robes. They like to have places of honor at feasts and chief seats in synagogues, to be greeted respectfully in the street and to be addressed as rabbi. But you must not be called rabbi, for you have one rabbi, and you are all brothers. Do not call any man on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor must you be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And he goes on. Alas, alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites that you are. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You do not enter yourselves, and when others are entering, you stop them. Alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites. You travel over sea and land to win one convert, and when you have won him, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are yourself. Let's skip down to verse 25. Alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, which you have filled inside by robbery and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, clean the inside of the cup first, then the outside will be clean also. Next. Alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you are like tombs covered with whitewash. They look well from outside, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all kinds. So it is with you. Outside you look like honest men, but inside you are brim full of hypocrisy and crime. Let's go down to verse 33. You snakes, you vipers brood, how can you escape being condemned to hell? I send you therefore prophets, sages, teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city. And so on you will fall all the innocent blood spilt on the ground, from innocent Abel to Zechariah, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Believe me, this generation will bear the guilt of it all. He's saying, this generation, because of your hypocrisy, will bear the guilt of every murder that has ever been committed. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets and stones the messengers sent to her, how often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? But you me. Look, there is your temple, forsaken by God. I tell you, you shall never see me until the time when you say, blessings on him who comes in the name of the Lord, which is the greeting that would come for a Messiah. Next chapter. Jesus was leaving the temple when his disciples came and pointed to the temple buildings. He answered, yes, look at it all. I tell you this, not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. So, I hope, even if you're unfamiliar with the literature generally, that you can sense that this is not only a religious condemnation, but that it's politics as well. And it's deeply rooted somehow in the political structure of Jesus' own time and place. Certainly the great temple in Jerusalem that dominated the religion of Israel, had dominated the religion of Israel for the previous 1,000 years, was here being cursed by Jesus himself. So between these two chapters you have one, the judgment on Jerusalem, which would soon to be destroyed, and the other, the judgment on the Jewish for destroying Jesus. And they're central really to the entire story of the gospel. But I think, if you just sat down and read this, it would be pretty volatile. But I remind you that these passages are not the prophetic revelations that Mr. Falwell still somehow presumes. He says, oh, well, this is just old stuff. Everybody knows that the Jews killed Christ. Everybody knows that they're the bad guys. And in the end of time, the Antichrist is Jewish. I mean, doesn't everybody know that? He says with great innocence. But what Mr. Falwell does not understand is that these ideas didn't just fall from the sky, nor are they the direct revelation of God himself. Although I actually heard Jerry Falwell on the radio, public radio, national audience, actually say, I could not believe this is about 4 or 5 months ago, that he believed firmly that it was Jesus Christ himself who wrote, I don't know how many, 7,462 words of Holy Scripture, that Jesus himself had written it all. Which is really bewildering because I don't know any human being anywhere on the globe who would make such a statement, let alone someone who's supposed to be a Christian leader. No, these ideas did not fall from the sky, nor are they revealed. They are specific expressions of the early church, written in a very specific historic. This is the beginning of an anti-Jewish polemic, is rooted in the very fabric of the Christian discourse that's established here with this story. If we recognize this and learn to read critically, to really try to understand, okay, where is this coming from? Who's writing this? When was it written? What are they trying to say? Perhaps we could make some sense out of the material. If we don't, if we just accept it as some sort of divine curse and do it critically, then the verses can become, as they have become, the basis of a virulent racism and a continuing anti-Semitic propaganda, and nothing will have changed. So, let me try that. I'm going to try to do both at the same time. Do a little bit of historical background, setting it in some sort of critical perspective, and reading through the material at the same time. First, this is a quickie. Let me turn this on. This is by way of doing maybe a 3-minute summary of the whole history of Israel. Okay. And really, to make it as simple as I can, it's based. The Jewish religion was based in the notion, the idea, that the one God of the universe, God who created the universe, had also at a certain time made a covenant with Israel. This one people, this chosen people. Part of that covenant involved ethical demands and responsibilities that the Jewish people had to live up to. And if they didn't, well, they got what they deserved. So there's an element of the covenant, and an element also is of you reap what you sow. The Hebrew prophets then came along much later in Jewish history, and they saw that this covenant was really to be understood in history itself, that the ups and downs, literally, of history and of the covenant were played out against a background of history. So let me show you what this is. I'll step away from the microphone for a moment. Most of this you probably know because I just got a new toy so I can use it. The idea is that everything goes from good to bad to good to bad to good to bad. Okay? So it starts with creation, which is good. Things go wrong, and there's a flood. It wipes out the whole world, and then God starts all over again. Right? And slowly builds up, making a covenant, this time with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchal family. That goes along through the whole book of Genesis. Things are fine. But they drift off into Egypt, and soon, by the time the book of Exodus rolls around, they find themselves enslaved. They are in bondage in Egypt. The Bible claims for 400 years. God realizes that this is his chosen people. He hears their cry, enters into history again, and redeems them. So the idea of exile redemption, set out right very, very early on. and is really the central myth, the central understanding of Hebrew Scripture. So they're brought out, and they're actually brought back to the Promised Land. That's the Exodus. They're brought back to Palestine. Hundreds of years go past. In the course of this time, King Solomon comes and builds a temple. That temple will stand, I have it listed here as the first temple, because there's going to be two of them. That is the temple that I referred to before that will last 4,000 years. It's destroyed shortly after the death of Jesus. So things go along well, but also times begin to disintegrate. Corruption comes into the government. The prophets say, and as a result, there's more exile. This time coming with the occasion of a Babylonian conquest, and the Jews are taken off into Babylonian exile. But once again, God remembers his covenant with his chosen people, and the prophets tell us God brings them back, changes all of history, moves things around, so that the Jewish people can be brought back to the Promised Land, and indeed they do, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, begin the task of reconstructing, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, this one known as the Second Temple. And that goes fine for a while. Oh, there were a couple of empires who come in between, and if you took my class, you'd learn about it. But anyway, as it goes on, it disintegrates, first through a Persian conquest, then a Greek conquest, and finally a Roman conquest. Rome being probably the biggest and harshest of all the empires. And it's in that period, it's in the period of the Roman occupation of Palestine, that Jesus is born and the temple will be destroyed. And it's at that moment, remember these times here, you see here's notes, back here, where's the picture? It's over here, 1800 BCE, before the Common Era. Egyptian bondage, about 1650 before the Common Era. The Exodus about 1250, the first temple about 900, the second temple about 400. Rome comes in about 63 and rules in Palestine for about 100 years, and then they destroy Jerusalem in the year 70. So that it's during that period. Let me change this. Well, okay, let me leave that there for a moment. It's during this period, the period when Rome is in power. So this narrows the focus, right? Here's 63 when Rome first occupies Palestine. And here really is when Jerusalem is destroyed. And right about in the middle of it, not in the year 0, but in the year, about the year 30 of the Common Era, is when Jesus was arrested and crucified. The first of the gospel stories that we have that tells us anything about that is written by Mark 40 years later, and by Matthew and Luke and John. So all the gospel accounts of Jesus were written 40, 50, 60, and 70 years after Jesus. It also means that the passages that we just read were not eyewitness accounts written at the crucifixion of Jesus, but they were written 50 years later by Matthew, looking back on this occasion, on this circumstance. Okay? That's an important thing to understand, because it's this disaster which falls on Jerusalem is probably in the long history of the Jews. I'm trying to think which is the worst disaster that ever happened. I'm not going to, no, I won't go there. I'm just not going to go there. There are too many. But this certainly was a pivotal moment in Jewish history, if for no other reason but that it really destroyed the ancient religion of Israel. The ancient religion of Israel, again, which had been there for 1,000 years, had as its central shrine this temple and this temple cult. There's a huge building, a huge structure, which brought in pilgrims from all over the world, on a regular basis, which had an institutionalized priesthood and an animal sacrifice that went on for 1,000 years. That was Jewish religion. Much of it was Jewish religion in antiquity. With the destruction of the temple, everything else went with it. And out of it came a remarkable thing. Out of that moment in time came the survivors of ancient Israel, the only group, the only leadership group that had any kind of integrity or understanding of the disaster, could put it together, namely the... And so what comes out of this moment in time is Rabbinic Judaism. Also what comes out of the same disaster is the birth of the early Christian church. So they really are aligned with each other. Originally, all the Christians that we read about, obviously Jesus himself was Jewish, but all of his followers were Jewish, and all of his enemies were Jewish. Through Romans, with a few Romans thrown in, but he, as far as we know, Jesus never even left Palestine. Traveled very little. Went from the north down to Jerusalem and maybe back a couple of times, and then got killed. That was the end of it. So he is not the great international traveler that Paul later would turn out to be, or the sophisticated Roman citizen. He's, as Don Crowson calls him, he's a Palestinian peasant. The next thing I'd like to say is another little breakdown during this period is what follows. It's often hard for somebody who is unfamiliar with the New Testament literature and to be able to distinguish that there's a lot of political activity going on. In the Gospel of John, if you ever get to read it, he simplifies the matter altogether, because when he condemns the Jews, he just calls them the Jews. And it's one almost blanket term. In the other Gospels, they will distinguish between Sadducees, between elders, between Pharisees, and so forth. In fact, we know that there was not one Judaism at this time. There was not even central authority, even though there was this great and well-established priesthood in Jerusalem. They ran the temple, they offered up the animal sacrifices, they also ran the national treasury, the national archive, and so they were important people. But when the masses of the Jewish people wanted advice or needed counsel, they never went to the priests, they went to local scholars, namely the rabbis. So there was a lot of stuff, and there were thousands of rabbis and thousands of different groups and thousands of different... So that I think that Judaism at that time was not unlike what Judaism is today, utter and total chaos. There is no center. It is not like even like a Methodist church. It's not like, certainly not like the Roman Catholic Church. There are groups, there are sects, there are sectarians, each one sometimes being very rivalrous with others and so forth. And we see that certainly during the time of Jesus. Let me show you. The people in charge, were, well, of course, it was Rome. There's no question about that. They're at the top, and they hold all the cards. They hold all the power. They have a monopoly on murder, which is to say that it is only Rome, ultimately, who has the monopoly on the death penalty. So legally, and even literally, in this passage that we just read, ultimately it's Pilate, the Roman governor, who sends Jesus off to be crucified. Nobody else has that authority. On the other hand, the passage that we read makes it quite clear that Pilate does not bear any moral responsibility for this. But the moral responsibility for the killing of Jesus goes to the elders and the Sadducees. Okay. So that's them, the temple priesthood, the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, who, in a sense, were really quite in league with Rome. The other party was the Jews, a king by the name of Herod, one of many Herodians in a dynasty, whom most of the masses of the people hated. Outside of this ruling class, which this is up here, you've had among the masses of the people innumerable sects and cults. The leading ones, the ones that we can identify clearly without doing too much archaeological digging at this point, are the Pharisees, namely the rabbis, a group called the Zealots, right? And who were, as it says, revolutionaries, and the Essenes, who we think lived in Qumran, and these are the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are all messianic cults. They are all messianic critics, which is to say that they all believed that the world had become so bad, so sunk in evil, that God would have to come into history again. Remember that up and down, up and down, up and down thing. Well, the Roman period was about as down as they could ever imagine things going, and so it was only a matter of speculation by these different groups, the masses of the people, not whether or if God would come, but just when it would come. If the covenant really existed and there really was a God, then surely he would enter into history and do away with the tyranny of the Romans. There were different timetables for that. The rabbis, I think, felt that it was perfectly all right to wait. In God's good time, this would happen. But even among them, there were a great variety of expectations. The Zealots were the ones who felt, no, we cannot wait, that it is really our responsibility to go out there and make this happen. And they almost did. And they were the ones, I think, who probably so provoked the Romans that in the course of time the Romans sent in the armies and just decided to Jerusalem and abolish the Jewish religion as much as they could altogether. The Essenes were a group of people who evidently just felt that they couldn't do anything, that the corruption had gone too far, that the best that they could do would be to drop out of society, go out to the Dead Sea, and wait again for a Messiah to come up. Their messianic expectation was for a righteous priest. Others expected a righteous king. Now, we've known about these group time. More recently, we've begun to talk about, other groups, and I think there are many, many, called charismatic sects. Very small, probably coming and going very quickly, leaving very little paper trail, so that it's really hard to document. And in that category, I put the Baptists, namely the followers of John the Baptist. In fact, and we know what happened to him, his head was chopped off and his group dissipated. So how do we know anything about it? If it hadn't been for Jesus, and it hadn't been for the history written about Jesus, we would know nothing about John the Baptist. I think that there are dozens and dozens of other small groups of that sort, with gurus, with messianic preachers, baptizers, who knows what, all over the place. Jesus hooked up with the Baptists at one point, and then separated and went his own way, started his own ministry. His followers, originally known as Nazarenes, followers of the rabbi from Nazareth. Those are the only two we can be really clear about. There were other groups as well once you went outside of Palestine. There was Philo in Alexandria. There were the Therapeutae also in Egypt, group of Jewish mystics. And then the Paulinists, who were somewhere between Christians and Jews, and also Hellenists. So I think if we start looking and we start documenting, as many of the scholars have done, they now talk not about Judaism at the time of Jesus, but the Judaisms that existed at the time of Jesus. Probably not unlike talking about Christianity. One could talk about Christianity in some sort of abstract, but when you come right down to it, there are how many varieties? Almost more than you could count. And my suspicion is that it looks something like that in Israel as well. When the temple was destroyed, let me go back to another slide. So I go back to this. When the temple was destroyed, the rabbis withdrew and did what they did best. They tried to hold things together And during this period, between 70 and 90, see it says down here, rabbis canonized Hebrew scripture. The rabbis went off to a small town. They made an arrangement with the Romans that they wouldn't have any further rebellions or any more difficulties if they could only have a small academy. And in that academy, they set about putting the final touches on what we now know as the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures. Much of it had been established canon in Hebrew tradition for hundreds and hundreds of years, but the last parts were now brought in. Books like Proverbs and Psalms and Job and other books of that sort. They brought in, by and large, all of the Hebrew writings. They left out everything that was in Greek. And there was a considerable amount of Jewish literature now written in Greek. While that is going on in Palestine, not far away, Matthew, probably in Damascus, is writing his gospel. He knows what's going on in Palestine. He knows about the destruction of the temple. He knows that the rabbis are now kind of putting the final touches on the Hebrew collection of sacred writing. But he has a huge argument with them because he feels that the rabbis do not understand what they have done. That it is they who were responsible for the death of Jesus, that it is they who were responsible ultimately for the persecuted early church, and as a result of that, they bring the destruction of Jerusalem upon themselves. And I point to you in one of those verses again, that maybe it will become very clear to you. In chapter 27, verse 33, he says, "You snakes, you vipers." Now, allegedly, this is Jesus speaking, right? But I'm saying to you, this is not Jesus speaking. This is Matthew speaking. 50 years after Jesus. Describing here is not a prophecy of things to come, but an experience of what he and his community was going through, what they felt they were going through. "You snakes, you vipers brood, how can you escape being condemned to hell? I send you therefore prophets, sages, and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city." Now, as far as I know, there's no real clear documentation that this is what was happening, that Christian, neo-Christians, I don't know what to call them, Nazarenes, within the Jewish community were being persecuted. Perhaps they were. Enough, certainly, so that some of them felt badly enough. We know that the rabbis later on pronounced a malediction, a curse, upon heretics, and it probably included these people. So they found an unwelcome mat in synagogues. And I think that what Matthew is writing about is that sense of disappointment and hurt of being excluded from the people. And so he strikes back at the authorities who are doing it, at the rabbis, by saying, "You'll get yours." And the "you'll get yours" is the destruction of the temple. It happened and you don't even see that you're responsible for it. So what I'm suggesting is this is not Jesus who is cursing anybody. This is not any kind of eyewitness account that we read here, but rather it is Matthew 15 trying to make some sense out of the alienation of his own group within the Jewish people. Okay. Unfortunately, this argument, the argument against the Jews, is what becomes the standard argument of the church, certainly while it's an underground group. And as time goes on, and now I'm going to see a show of hands. How many of you were able to download the material for today? Okay. And even more importantly, to look at it. Again, we will not have time to do that here, but certainly I hope in your sessions you'll be able to do it. You'll see after this thing called the Adversus Judaeos. Rosemary Ruther, a Catholic scholar, says that the ongoing of Orthodox Christianity as it develops out of the New Testament continues to perpetuate the idea that the Christians were the victim people, that they were the ones who were being victimized, clearly by the Jews, not by the Romans, of course, but by the Jews. And that sense of victimization goes on, or went on from that time and all through history. Even when, what's remarkable about that is even after Christianity attained to state power, after the time of the Emperor Constantine, Christians continued to see themselves as victims when standing before Jews. But Rosemary Ruther says that the rhetoric tried to counterbalance that by saying that what had happened is that with the deicide, with the killing of Jesus, God had broken off his covenant with Israel and made a new covenant, New Testament, made a new covenant with the new Israel, which was the church. So this is the word supersession, that Christianity supersedes Judaism. It's the natural outgrowth. It's what follows. The Jews have been rejected. They were once the elect people. Now they have been rejected. And Christianity has been elected. She also refers to it as the left hand of Christology. The right hand of Christology is the proclamation of the church that the Messiah has come and his salvation is free for everybody. That's the right hand. And the left hand is for everybody except the Jews who have been rejected. And again, I say that what's going on here is it's a battle between siblings. It's a battle between sects. It's a battle between people. It's a battle between brothers or sisters who are rivals with one another for the affection and the attention of the father, the affection and attention of the mother. They're two groups trying to realize themselves in a world, in fact, full of destruction and persecution. It was not easy, it was not obvious for them to be able, nor was it practical for them really to turn and say, look, it's Rome, they're the ones who are oppressing us. Instead, they turn and start blaming each other. And that rhetoric becomes the style of the whole of the Middle Ages. What becomes known as the adversus Judaeos, that's the argument against the Jews, is a continuing theme that will go through the rest of history up to and including the time of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, I've even seen articles more recently that will say the same things. A bishop here, a bishop there, that still will say, or a Jerry Falwell here or a Jerry Falwell there, who will still say the same sorts of things. We have no time to read all of this now, maybe one or two. The first one, under the Adversus Judaeos, this one by Hippolytus in the year 220. Why was the temple made desolate? Was it on account of the ancient fabrication or was it on account of the idolatry of the people? Was it for the blood of the prophets? Was it for the adultery and fornication of Israel? By no means. For in all these transgressions they always found pardon open to them. But it was because they killed the son of their benefactor, for he is co-eternal with the Father. They killed God. That's the charge. You see, this is the Christian orthodoxy that Jerry Falwell was talking about. He happened to be telling the truth. Inadvertently, of course, and realize that that's the case. But this has been part of the rhetoric for the last 2,000 years. Next one, from John Chrysostom. Amazing. If someone had killed your son, could you stand the sight of him or the sound of his greeting? Wouldn't you try to get away from him as if he were an evil demon, as if he were the devil himself? Well, he said, the Jews killed the son of your master. Will you so dishonor him as to respect and cultivate his murderers, the men who crucified him? You know what he's criticizing? The fact that Jews and Christians were getting along too well in his city. He says this friendliness cannot go on. And then condemns the Jews as if this murder had just happened yesterday. I mean, even if you could blame the whole generation of Jews, which doesn't make sense anyway, as if there were no distinction at all. The Jews living today are the same as the Jews who were living then. And it's not a critical way of viewing history. That goes on and on. Maybe the last one here. Also John Chrysostom. When animals have been fattened by having all they want to eat, they get stubborn and hard to manage. Another prophet intimates the same thing when he says, Israel ran about madly like a heifer stung by a gadfly, and still another an untrained calf. When animals are unfit for work, they were marked for slaughter. And this is the very thing which the Jews have experienced. By making themselves unfit for work, they have become ready for slaughter. This is why Christ said, this is unbelievable, "Ask for my enemies who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me." Frankly, I don't know when Jesus said anything like that, but John's recollection of that. And when is that? That is 390. This is very ancient. Right? On the next page, if you turn over, we have kind of the ongoing dialogue. It's a list collected by Raoul Hilberg in The Destruction of European Jews. And what he has on the left-hand column is the canon law, which reads out prescriptions against Jews. This is under the direct sponsorship of the Church, the approval of the Vatican over this, of the Pope anyway. The Vatican didn't exist at that point, but over the centuries. Right? From the prohibition of marriage and sexual intercourse between Christians and Jews, to Jews not being allowed to hold public office, burning of the Talmud, burning of Jewish books, the Jews being required to wear certain markings and badges on their clothes to identify themselves, on and on and on. And with every one of these canon laws, so starting from the year 306 and going up to the year 1434, there's a direct parallel to Nazi legislation. In the few years of Hitler's regime, starting 1933, when various rights and privileges of German citizenship were stripped one after another away from the Jews, and they were isolated. I think that in part there was certainly an outrage in Germany at that time, but I often wondered to myself why there was not a greater outrage even within the Jewish population itself. And I really think that they had seen it before, and that people believed that, oh, this would pass. And that Europeans, and this is the best that I can say about the European situation, is the Europeans accepted this because it had happened many times before. Now, they had no idea, I don't think anybody really could imagine, that Hitler's plan was ultimately to annihilate the entire people. But to persecute them, to put them in their place, to, to slap their wrist, to do these kinds of, to confiscate their property, to ban them from dating your daughter, things like this were felt to be perfectly normal, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that hadn't been seen before. And so there's a long history. One could go on and on and on with this. There were expulsions from England. Jews were expelled from England in 1391. They were expelled from France in 1391. They were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. The property confiscated, forcible conversions, on and on and on. I don't know if I have time. What time is it? Give me a reading on when we absolutely must stop, because I want to stop and give time for questions. You have 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes to talk. Was just to reference Luther. I won't read. I had a document here to read where Luther in 1543 virtually spells out a policy which Hitler would later follow. And some of the Nazis who were put on trial in Nuremberg actually invoked Luther to say, well, all we were doing was just carrying out what Luther recommended. In 1543, he wrote an essay called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. And in a little seizure of vituperation and bile, he just pours out a program of what to do with Jews, which includes, first, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire. I'm just going to skip very quickly. Second, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of prayer books and their Talmuds, and sacred books should be burned. Fourth, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifth, their passport and traveling privilege absolutely forbidden to Jews. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from usury, from engaging in commerce and trade. And then it goes on with a few other things. And then he says, if, however, we are afraid that they might harm us personally or our wives, children, servants, cattle, And so it goes on. Okay, here. To sum up, and he's writing this to the princes of Germany, to sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does you, then find a better one, so that you and we may be free of this insufferable devilish burden, the Jews. That was 1543. So there's a long history. As a matter of fact, the real miracle is that the Jews lived in Europe and prospered in spite of it anyway, through periods in between. But when the Holocaust came, when Hitler came to power, I think for most people it seemed like, oh, it was severe and bad, but not unthinkable and not unusual. I think they didn't realize how far it would go. Well, so that brings us to the Holocaust itself. So I'm saying, I think that not that this Christian rhetoric, that this orthodox anti-Judaism, which turns into a racist anti-Semitism, is Nazism. I'm not making that equation. But it did prepare the way for the Nazis to be able to get away with it in Europe. Bamboozle everybody and to persuade them that this was actually probably even a good thing, to get rid of the Jews. Okay. It took the Holocaust itself, I think, to wake people up. But it wasn't, not right away. It wasn't until 1965 at the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council in Rome, that the Roman Catholic Church really sat down and did some serious recon on this and began issuing a whole new policy. And that's called the Nostra Aetate, and that's this table that you have here. And it compares statements made in 1965, Vatican guidelines issued in 1975, notes for preaching and catechesis in 1985, that are instructions for how Roman Catholics should now approach relationships with the Jewish people. And it is all extremely conciliatory. It says things that I would say. For instance, third column over, down item number 3. Listen, references hostile or less than favorable to the Jews have their historic context in conflicts between the nascent church and the Jewish community. They're saying, no, you got to get it out of your head that Jesus said these things, that these are curses, that these are ideas that fell from heaven. They are not ideas that fall from heaven, but they are ideas that arise from historic circumstance themselves. Certain controversies reflect Christian-Jewish relations long after the time of Jesus. It's exactly what I have said, all right? So this has been said before, many other things. More recently, it's only a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, March 17th, 1998, this Pope, who has, I think, genuinely shown some effort to try to make, to walk the line of reconciliation with the Jewish people, still finds it difficult to go all the way. And there are all kinds of apologies and seeming recognitions for the fact that Christians throughout Europe really participated in this preparation for the coming of the Holocaust. But in this statement that was issued a year ago, that's where it's left. It was individual responsibility. It does not say that the church had any responsibility at all. In spite of the fact that, again, all you got to do is take a look at papal edicts through the ages to recognize that Jews have always been vilified, cursed, excluded, and demonized as part of official church policy. Again, the only thing that Jerry found right. And in this statement issued last year, the Vatican said, the Shoah, using a nice Hebrew word too for the Holocaust, the Shoah was the work of a thoroughly modern neo-pagan regime. Its anti-Semitism, they say, had its roots outside of Christianity. That's bewildering, absolutely baffling. At the same time, they say, but it may be asked whether the Nazi persecution of the Jews made easier by the anti-Jewish prejudices embedded in some Christian minds and hearts. You see, it keeps it on the individual level. Not embedded in the official teachings of the church. Right? Did anti-Jewish sentiment among Christians make them less sensitive or even indifferent to the persecution launched against the Jews by National Socialism when it reached its power? Can I take another couple of minutes? And I want to go, like, where do we go from here? I think there are two things really. I mean, and what you're going to see over the next year or two, or maybe longer, is battles over apologies. He should apologize more. They should take more guilt. They should do this. They should do that. I think, frankly, the task is more difficult. And I think there are only two options available. They could work simultaneously. One is this. Of course, this ongoing dialogue and friendship and reviewing our past is an absolute necessity for everybody. So that should continue. But the other alternatives are, one, dump the New Testament. All right, that's an easy one. Denounce it or rewrite it. Unheard of, unthinkable, right? Well, okay, I just want to say very quickly, not so. New Testaments have come and gone. The scriptures have come and gone depending on publishers. I just want to let you know that the Jesus Seminar, one of the new books that they're coming out with, is going to be called The Gospel According to Jesus Seminar. And what it does is it publishes what they think are the authentic teachings and sayings and deeds associated with the historical Jesus, and they're writing it, and they're just going to publish it in the form of a gospel. I haven't read it, but I've read the outline and the table of contents, and it's very sweet. It looks like any other gospel, except you would not believe it. There will be no anti-Judaism in it. There is no anti-Semitism in it. There's also a lot of other things that are not in it. For instance, there are no claims, Jesus makes no claims to be the Messiah, or God, or anybody else. So it's not going to be terribly popular. But they are bona fide scholars, and they're going to publish it, and it's going to be a throwing down of the gauntlet. Here is a critical way of looking at this literature. So that's one thing I think that really needs to be done, critical reading of it. And the last thing I want to say is the other thing is, well, either publish and either do a New Testament, or when you read the New Testament, make the effort. And I think the church does this. In this country, they make the effort to teach it critically. They don't let the ideas slip by anymore. The real problem is that the church, the Roman Catholic Church, even though it's big, it's really big, we got over 1 billion people in the world, don't have control over Jerry Falwell or over people elsewhere in the world are converted and become Christian and who have never seen a Jew and who pick up the same old New Testament and read the same old racist garbage and come away with the same old attitudes that have been part of the Adversus Judaeus through the centuries. John Dominic Crossan, I'll conclude with this, wrote in a book which he published a few years ago, and he's one of the leading New Testament scholars, Who Killed Jesus? And then it's subtitled, Exposing the Roots of Anti-Semitism in the Gospel Story of the Death of Jesus. So he goes right to the jugular on this. And this is what he writes. This in particular, when he's considering the juxtaposition of the Jewish demands for Jesus' crucifixion, and at the same time Roman declarations of Jesus' innocence. Pilate washing his hands, saying, gee, the poor guy didn't do anything. He said, is not prophecy, and neither is it. It is Christian propaganda. Okay? Let me be very clear about what I'm saying. By the way, I want to say something about Crossan. Crossan was a priest. I don't know, was he a Jesuit?
He's a bishop.
No, he's never a bishop, God forbid. No, but I think he may have been a Jesuit, but I'm not sure. He was certainly very well trained a priest. I think I don't know if he left the priesthood because he's married now. But he's still a New Testament scholar. One of the most widely read, and gutsy. He says, let me be very clear about what I'm saying. For Christians, the New Testament texts and gospel accounts are inspired by God. But divine inspiration necessarily comes through a human heart and a mortal mind, through personal prejudice and communal interpretation, through fear, dislike, and hate, as well as faith, hope, and charity. It can also come as inspired propaganda, and inspiration does not make it any the less propaganda. In its origins, moments that Christian propaganda was fairly innocent. Those first Christians were relatively powerless Jews, and compared to them, the Jewish authorities represented serious and threatening power. As long as Christians were the marginalized and disenfranchised ones, such passion fiction about Jewish responsibility and Roman innocence did nobody much harm. But once the Roman Empire became Christian, that fiction turned lethal. In light of later Christian anti-Judaism and eventually of genocidal anti-Semitism, it is no longer possible, in retrospect, to think of that passion fiction as relatively benign propaganda. However explicable its origins, defensible its invectives, and understandable its motives among Christians fighting for survival, its repetition has now become the longest lie. And for our integrity, we, Christians, must at last name it as such. It is a lie. Okay, thank you.
I would ask students to stay in their place while we take a few questions. I know we're going to run a little over today. Questions?
Questions? So everything's perfectly clear. Great. Gene, let's wait. Let's wait for. Is there anybody? Any other students? Any other students?
Students have no questions.
No questions. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Please. Yes. Yeah, of course. The man who began the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, sure. Yeah. Yes. Okay. No, behind you. Just only because you're privileged. Go ahead.
I thought I heard when you went over the list of the persecutions and so on, and then tied it to the Nazi program. It sounded a little bit to me like maybe we were getting into the area of collective guilt on the part of Christians, whereas I think that's the wrong way to put it. There's always been that strain of collective guilt on the Jews, but now aren't we turning that right on its head and saying now the persecution of the Jews, justified or not, however the Nazis justified it, and then they, bringing back, well, isn't that what Luther said, and so on. Isn't that now a collective guilt on the part of the Christians for having the Holocaust, etc., happen?
Well, in a cultural level, I would have to say yes. I think that's what it is. Because we're dealing with is a 2,000-year-old tradition. So it's the tradition as it continued to be perpetuated and passed on. On the other hand, I would never want to say that it has any kind of racial characteristic. It has nothing to do with the fact that Germans are Germans, for instance, if that's why it happened. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the way Christianity became institutionalized in Europe and the rhetoric that it took on. I mean, you could see, even without many Jews present, you could see the kind of horrors that are going on in Yugoslavia today, the kind of bitterness and anger that exists between different ethnic groups. It has been endemic. It's been an endemic part of European history and European society for a very, very long time, and it's something that all Europe are struggling, many are struggling to really grapple with now that we face a new millennium. But part of Hitler's promise was to make Europe free of Jews, Judenrein, and he was almost successful in doing that. And I think it just means that they have to look at what really happened. It's not a matter of collective guilt. I don't mean to say that. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up for a second, one of Hitler's aims was also, after he won the war, as he figured he was going to do, to make Europe free of Christians as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Going to make the Nazi Party the only church.
Yes, and that definitely was part of the plan. There would be no question about that. And the Vatican notes that in self-defense. Yeah. Yes?
Do you think did the Holocaust hurt the rabbinic Hebrew tradition of downfall redemption?
Boy, I would like to have a redemption seminar to follow that one up. Yeah, in other words, what happens to the promise that God made to the Jewish people? To, you know, that up and down thing. Well, I think we've gotten away with it in this generation, although I haven't forgotten myself. But generally, I think the post-war Jewish generation got away with it by thinking subtly that the reestablishment of the State of Israel was somehow the compensation. But I don't think we've dealt with it. I don't think that anybody is... I think what happened is that the struggle over the reestablishment of the State of Israel eclipsed any real serious thinking about that. And we haven't really struggled with it at all. One would raise the question, was the reestablishment of the State of Israel worth it? Wasn't the price a little bit too high, if the reward is? And secondly, the state isn't that secure. So I think the religious question is and should be open for Jews as well as Christians on this matter. Yeah. Anybody else? Good question. Somebody? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Yeah. Jim.
At what point in history did the idea that Christ died for our sins come in? And how was that reconciled with the idea that Christ had to die in order for sins to be
Well, that comes with Paul. A relatively few years right after Jesus. As a matter of fact, there is one quote, and again, when you go to your study sessions on this, I just refer you to it. It's a passage from Romans, where he talks about the partial blindness that is Israel, and the suffering. He says, in spreading the gospel, the Jewish people, they are treated as God's enemies for your sake, for the sake of the Christians. So the Jews are being persecuted for the sake of the Christians. But then he goes on, but God's choice stands. They are his friends, and for the sake of patriarchs. For the gracious gifts of God and his calling are irrevocable. So out of that comes the idea that Christ died for our sins. And once the whole world has converted and seen the truth of that, by the way, Jerry Falwell is very much a follower of this. This is why he supports the State of Israel. Because he believes that Christ will come, like any year now, any day, and that the final redemption will be the conversion of the Jews. So he's still kind of harping on that. The idea that Christ died for us is very, very, very early. And that's Paul.
Thank you very much.
One more from Gene? Okay.
Yeah.
Gene.
Okay, we'll let Gene answer.
Okay. I just want to mention the name Yeshua Bar Abbas.
Yeah.
The translation, it's in the Bible, it's in the here, you can't get away from it. The translation of that is Jesus, Son of the Father. That whole crowd, this is Passover time, when a jillion people, that whole crowd was yelling, in my estimate, this is my theological interpretation, is based on that. They were yelling for the release of Jesus.
You mean it was all a mistake?
Whoa, wait, no. The Romans and the temple cult were very, very fearful of a revolution.
You're staying